technical problem with flaps was reported. Loss of situational awareness leads to misdirection into mountain. Plane crashes into mountainside. The beginning of a journey with no room for error. The morning of a late July day in 1992, at Don Mueang Airport, the Thai Airways Airbus A310 was being prepared for flight TG311. A journey that seemed routine but always hid significant risks, truly understood only by those who had flown to Nepal. This was not a route for complacency. Tribhuvan Airport in Kathmandu is nestled within a rock mountain arc, lacking modern landing support systems, and even a minor deviation in procedure could put the crew in a difficult situation. Veteran professionals know, landing at Tribhuvan is not just about technique, but about absolute vigilance. The crew that day included 2 pilots with a combined tens of thousands of hours of experience.
Fuel and safe logs signed.
Yet this
Check the
journey
tail.
was still a true test.
Confirmed.
They
We are
had to
clear for
strictly
pushback.
follow winding routes necessitated by the terrain. The plane had to hit every waypoint, every altitude, and every rudder deflection precisely. The 2 pilots were not allowed to let their minds wander for even a few seconds, as they were surrounded by an imposing wall of mountains. Preparing for a flight like TG311 was more than just
Copy that.
loading luggage
Log.
and checking fuel.
Let's check
It
the
required
hydraulics next.
reviewing every system, every wing section,
golden
and
hour
every
is coming
parameter.
along.
If the
Every
deviation
morning,
exceeded the
the
allowed
apron
limit,
comes alive
the
with the
crew had to
synchronized
seriously
movement of
consider
aircraft and
immediate
ground support.
diversion. With treacherous terrain like Nepal's, no one dared to try and see. Everything had to be clear from the ground. From the outside, this was just a linear flight lasting over 3 hours. But for those who understood the profession, TG311, from the moment it began to taxi, carried the distinct tension of mountain routes. Narrow airspace, minimal reaction time, and no second chance to correct a mistake. This context set the stage for the subsequent chain of events. A series of small, interconnected slip-ups that ultimately led to the tragedy over the Himalayas. When the cockpit was no longer a true team, as the A310 left Bangkok and proceeded on its long journey towards the Himalayas, a subtle problem emerged right inside the cockpit. The coordination between the 2 pilots was not the seamless collaboration an ideal crew should have. The 41-year-old captain was highly experienced. Over 13,000 flight hours was not a number everyone in the industry achieved, and he had faced difficult routes like Tribhuvan many times. But personal experience, no matter how vast, could not replace the necessary support from the person sitting next to him. The first officer was older, but his practical experience in Nepal was very limited. He was unfamiliar with how the terrain forced the crew to react quickly and precisely to every detail. In aviation, coordination is more than just exchanging a few short sentences. It means understanding each other through just a look, an operation, or a hand movement. And on TG311, that did not happen. From the cruising phase until the approach preparation, the captain had to handle almost everything. Controlling the aircraft, monitoring parameters, communicating with air traffic control, ATC, and managing continuous minor changes. The first officer was present, but seemed detached from the rhythm of the flight. Delayed responses by a few beats, unnecessary questions, and ill-timed operations all accumulated, turning the workload, which should have been shared, into a burden primarily placed on one person in a normal environment. This lack of synchronicity might not have obvious consequences, but when flying in a high mountain region, where every minute could be decisive, it was extremely risky for one pilot to take on both roles. This imbalance was the first weak link in the chain that would lead TG311 further away from the safety zone. What happened next was not simply an individual error, but the inevitable consequence when a crew loses the cohesion that should be the foundation of every flight. The flap system warning. As TG311 began to descend in preparation for approach to Tribhuvan Airport, things became heavier. The already uncoordinated cockpit now faced a technical problem that should never have occurred on a flight in such hazardous mountain terrain. The flaps, the parts that help the aircraft slow down and maintain lift at low speeds, failed to extend correctly. The warning panel lit up, and the captain immediately understood this was no small matter. Significantly, this fault was not new. It had appeared 2 weeks earlier, and although the aircraft was returned to service, the repair was clearly not thoroughly addressed. In this industry, any component related to low speed must be absolutely stable, especially when landing in a difficult terrain like Kathmandu. A small error could turn the entire approach path into a dead-end slope. The captain did not hesitate. He asked the first officer to check the entire flap configuration again, but the response from the side seat was only slow and uncertain answers. With his experience, the captain knew he could not force the A310 to land with jammed flaps. That would be a gamble no one wanted to take. He immediately notified ATC. TG311 was aborting the landing and requesting to circle back to assess the situation. That decision was correct in every textbook, but it also opened up a new challenge. Circling in Kathmandu was not a gentle turn like at lowland airports. This was an area where every passing minute pulled the aircraft closer to the imposing mountain ranges. When the flap system was not working correctly,
Warning.
control
Lateral
over
navigation
altitude and
deviation.
speed became even more
Check
sensitive.
flight
In
path.
that moment, TG311 was no longer just a flight with a minor glitch. It became a rigorous test of the crew's skill, discipline, and coordination, elements that were already out of sync from the start. And the cumulative effect of these weaknesses would lead the A310 to the next minutes full of uncertainty. Confused ATC and the chain of dangerous misunderstandings. When the aircraft was struggling in the dark sky and bad weather, the crew desperately needed a clear voice from the ground. But instead, they only heard confusing answers from a 21-year-old air traffic controller who was still in training. Rarely is the chaos in the cockpit extended simply because the ground controllers do not grasp what is happening. Here, ATC did not have radar or a full overview. They relied only on their ears and paper notes. And when the only person manning the frequency was an inexperienced trainee, almost every request from the pilots was translated into a different direction. Every question from the crew about position, heading, or safe distance was met with answers as vague as the fog outside. They asked one thing, ATC replied with another. Not out of malice, but because the young controller simply did not understand the terminology or how to guide in a tense situation. In moments like these, just one wrong instruction can cause the aircraft to drift completely off the safe flight path. Even when the crew tried to pull ATC back on track with confirmation questions, what they received were still instructions off by a few degrees, a few miles, enough to make the whole flight precarious. In the profession, we understand that pilots need a solid system behind them. But that night, that system was standing on the most trembling legs. And it was the vagueness from the ground that forced the aircraft to navigate itself in an airspace where it should have been guided every step of the way. This was not just an individual error. It was the consequence of an operating facility that was unprepared, unequipped, and placed too much expectation on an apprentice. One weak link pulled the entire chain of events into danger. The overloaded captain and the error in a moment of stress. Following the string of misunderstandings with air traffic control, the cockpit fell into a state that any crew would want to avoid. The captain had to bear the entire workload himself. In 3 decades of work, I have seen many high-pressure situations, but rarely has a captain had to juggle all 4 critical tasks that should have been evenly divided between 2 people. The first officer, due to his lack of experience and slow reactions, continuously re-questioned procedure steps, causing a bottleneck in the workflow. Meanwhile, the captain was simultaneously stabilizing the aircraft in bad weather, checking fuel, and dealing with the malfunctioning flap system. Additionally, he also had to re-enter the flight path into the navigation computer, an operation that requires absolute concentration. While it is difficult for one person to do 3 things at once on the ground, in the sky, every touch on the control panel carries a responsibility as heavy as steel. And exactly at that moment, fatigue began to seize him. Not the kind of absent-minded tiredness, but the kind caused by prolonged stress, where a single missed beat of the eye, a single incorrect character typed by hand, and the entire aircraft goes in a different direction. He entered a waypoint incorrectly, a very minor error, but enough to make the aircraft gradually turn towards the Himalayan mountain range without the crew's knowledge. In the industry, we call it the domino effect in the cockpit, when continuous pressure causes a person to lose sight of the big picture. And that night, the captain made a mistake not due to carelessness, but because he had to do the work of 2 people in an environment that allowed no moment of rest. This is how small mistakes become great risks, not in a flash, but through layers of pressure piled upon a person trying to keep the aircraft safe. Lost direction in the night sky and the irrecoverable mistake. When the flap system finally complied, the aircraft stabilized again at about 11,500 feet. a number that seemed safe, but was full of risk when the highest mountain ranges on the planet were ahead. That was an altitude where any experienced pilot must be cautious, because even a slight deviation in direction would lead the aircraft into rough terrain with little room to maneuver. But after a series of pressures, the chaos with air traffic control, the malfunctioning flaps, and the captain having to carry the entire cockpit, the crew's ability to maintain the overall picture began to waver. This is what we in the industry call loss of situational awareness, a silent but extremely dangerous state. The pilots were still controlling the aircraft, still working constantly, but their minds were no longer connected to the entire surrounding context. And it was then that the aircraft began to turn north. It was not a sharp turn, but a slight yet steady deviation, like a car gradually drifting out of its lane without the driver noticing. At that altitude, being off by just a few miles means placing oneself in front of massive rock walls. But the captain, after too many tasks at once, did not recognize the small deviation was pulling the entire flight into the danger zone. With no radar support from the ground, no one in the cockpit reminded them of the flight direction, and no one cross-checked the actual position. Everyone was busy firefighting the immediate problems and forgot the most basic thing, where the aircraft was going. When the ground proximity warning system, GPWS, suddenly sounded, it was no longer a gentle reminder. It was the only way to say that the rock wall ahead was too close. And in that moment, all the errors from the previous minutes converged into a situation with no way out at Aviation. A principle is constantly repeated. Accidents rarely stem from one major flaw. They come from a chain of small, overlooked details, layers of pressure stacked on top of each other, until time does not allow for even 1 second more to correct the mistake. The final moments and the investigation's full picture, when the terrain warning system sounded like a frantic bell, the aircraft no longer had enough distance to escape the rock wall in front of it. At cruising speed and in dark conditions, any salvage maneuvers were only instinctive. The aircraft crashed into the mountainside, ending the journey in a moment so brief that no one could react. The number of 113 lives lost was not just cold statistics. It was the end point of a chain of errors that extended from the ground all the way to the cockpit. When the investigation team began analysis, they were not looking for a single culprit. In this industry, stories are rarely that simple. Instead, they connected every piece of data. The flap system had been problematic from the start, placing Thai Airways maintenance procedures under scrutiny. Air traffic control gave inaccurate instructions, then missed the opportunity to correct the error even when seeing abnormal signals. In the cockpit, the captain was worn down by too many tasks, gradually losing the big picture. And the first officer, who should have been the second pair of eyes, was silent for too long, failing to perform the required cross-checks. Each small error, standing alone, was not that serious. But when they piled up, the aircraft was like it was walking on a thread too thin to maintain balance. The investigation concluded that this tragedy was a cumulative consequence, not a sudden, unexpected accident. The aftermath involved unprecedented decisions. The relevant air traffic controller was dismissed immediately after the final report, and Thai Airways had to take full responsibility and compensate the families of all victims in aviation. One thing is always clear. Incidents like this do not start with one major shock. They begin with lax habits, a procedure being overlooked, a warning being ignored. And by the time people realize it, the safety line has been broken for a long time.